We've got a number of feast days coming up this week. Monday, obviously, is the Feast of the Presentation, which is also the Feast of Our Lady of Good Success of the Purification. That's the statue of her over there. It's also Candlemas. And then Tuesday is St. Blaise's feast day. So just a lot going on this week. And because we're allowed to move the blessing of the throats to the weekend, we're doing that after all the masses this weekend. So both of my shoulders feel like I've just pitched 18 innings for the Tigers in a losing match. It's been a good weekend, let's say that. So because of the fact we're doing that at the end of Mass, the homily will be a few minutes shorter than normal. No clapping, please. And that will enable everybody to take part in the ritual of the blessing of the throats. So, to get down to brass tacks. Today we hear the gospel commonly called the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount. The word beatitude comes from the Latin beatudo, which means not only to be blessed. That's one of the things about the translation into English, is it doesn't convey the full context, and we've lost a lot of it. To be blessed, but also to rejoice in that blessing. It's a certain happiness that comes along with the blessing, with the reception of God's grace. One receives God's grace, therefore one has joy also. This is what the Latin word really means. And so whenever we say the word in English, to be blessed, that's what we have to understand. It's not just, bless you, or God bless you, that God give you grace. But there's a certain joy that is attached to that. We're supposed to also rejoice in the reception of God's grace. So keep that in mind. Next time you talk about being blessed or asking for someone to be blessed, to receive God's grace and also to receive the joy in the knowledge that God has given you grace. So that's what this gospel is talking about. That's what all these phrases are, the blesseds. That's what it would be. It'd be, rejoice because of God's grace, so on and so forth. And Matthew, as we know, his gospel contains a lot of interesting little details that the other ones don't contain. We talked about this last week, the reason why he does this. Because those Jews who are becoming Christians would have understood these things for what they are. Immediately, they would have picked them up. And today's gospel has a big one of those that most of us don't give a second thought to. But for the people who first heard this gospel, this is something very important. And it still is important at the end of the day, it's just most of us don't understand it. The very first sentence of the gospel. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he had sat down, his disciples came to him. Why does Matthew have to include the fact that it was not until after Christ sat down that he began to teach? It might sound like just an unimportant detail, but it is a very important detail because for these people, when you sat down to teach the Word of God, it meant that you were speaking with authority. Moses, whenever he would come out to deliver God's message to the people, he would be seated. You're speaking as a representative of God now, as authority on the subject of what God has revealed when you sit down to teach the Word of God. The same was true with the philosophers and all that kind of stuff too. They would sit. That means you're a master of the subject also. You were able to sit on a chair. Everybody else had to stand or sit on the floor around you usually, because you were a master in possession of all the knowledge. And so Matthew includes that Christ intentionally sat down before he began to preach this particular part of the gospel to them, telling us that he's speaking with authority, that he's speaking of the revelation of God, and that he is a master. He possesses the master's knowledge on this subject. The church still uses this phrase. It's called ex cathedra in Latin, from the chair. Every year we celebrate the chair of St. Peter. Do you ever think about that? That's what it symbolizes, the authority. And so whenever the Pope or the Bishop does something or says something that is obligatory for us to believe, they will always be seated when they do that, because they are seated on the seat of the teacher at that point. Like if, for instance, the last time a formal dogma was declared was 1958, that was Pope Pius XII, the dogma of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. If you go back, you can find actual footage of the recording of that, and he's seated when he declares this dogma. He's speaking from the chair now as the authority on the subject, as the one who is speaking the word of God to people. So it's an important little detail. Christ himself speaks of this later on when he says, the Pharisees have taken their place on the seat of Moses, that they have been tasked with following after Moses, taking the seat of those who give instruction. So Christ is speaking as the master, the authority on the subject here at this moment. And the people, again, who were there would have picked this up immediately, because wandering itinerant preachers would just walk around. John the Baptist knows, it says John the Baptist never sat down to preach. He always preached either on the banks or in the water already. You don't sit down in the water because you drown, usually. So, the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Poorness in spirit, poverty of spirit. It is a certain detachment from things of this world. In a world that is torn between outright idolatrous materialism and godless communism, there's something in between. As St. Paul said, to be in the world, but not of the world. The poor in spirit are those who are able to use the good things of this life in the proper manner while not letting themselves become enamored or enraptured by them. To not let things determine their value, their worth, their dignity, that all those are great and wonderful, but they don't add anything to my value as a human being. Poverty of spirit is the ability to separate those things that really are important, my soul and getting to heaven, from things of this world. Those things are good, but they are not the reason why I exist. That's why Jesus says the poor in spirit are the ones who will inherit the kingdom of heaven, because their heart is already in the right place at that point. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. He's not just talking about everybody who decides to cry and be sorrowful all the time. It's a very specific meaning. Who mourn over sin, who express sorrow over sin, and not just their own, but the sins of others. Not just because it's sad and people do dumb things, but because we know what sin does to the relationship with God. In my own life, but also when I see other people committing grievous sins, I know what that's doing to the relationship with God. And therefore, it fills us with sorrow, because we know the damage that that's going to cause them. Jesus says only those who are able to be sorrowful over those things, who are able to mourn them, will be comforted, as they turn to him in the midst of that. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Meekness is a very misunderstood virtue. Most people think it means just, oh yeah, go ahead, spit in my face, punch me in the eye, it doesn't matter, it's fine. No, if you throw hands, I'm throwing hands back at you. If there's a good reason, at least, But there's nothing wrong with defending oneself. Meekness and charity and humility do not say I cannot defend myself. I have an obligation sometimes to defend myself. Meekness comes from the virtue of humility. Meekness is a virtue which comes from the virtue of humility. Humility comes from the virtue of charity, love. Meekness is a deeper and more full understanding that, number one, I am not always right. I have flaws and vices, and that what I desire is not always the best thing. That I'm not always right. That I'm not always after the best thing. Sometimes I don't want the good thing. And meekness is that understanding of that, and therefore I'm going to adjust how I act because I know how broken I can be in some of these things. So a certain distance sometimes, not forcing everyone to do just what I want to do because I want it done, or the way I want it done. I'm not always right. I'm not even always good. And meekness helps me to understand that and therefore act accordingly. That's why Jesus says those are the ones who will inherit the land, because they're able to put themselves behind someone else. They're able to put themselves back, and therefore they will be ready when the time comes to inherit the land. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Righteousness is a concept we've spoken of often. Righteousness in the scriptural sense does not mean that everybody just plays nice together, everybody gets the same of everything, everybody's equal in all these things. No. Righteousness, remember, means the desire to see God's will fulfilled in all things and above all things. That is the driving force, the motivating force, and the ultimate goal, to see God's will fulfilled in all things and above all things. And Christ says the desire for that is so deep it can be compared to hunger and thirst, the things the body experiences. Two of the most, I guess you call them, violent urges of the body are hunger and thirst. Christ says those who desire God's righteousness that deeply, says they are the ones who will be satisfied. Why? Because God's will be done. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Mercy is a nice thing, a very misunderstood thing in our world, even by many in the church. This idea that mercy means I have to pretend basically like nothing happened at all. Just close my eyes to the facts. Oh, everything's wonderful. In order to be merciful, one has to acknowledge that things are wrong. In order to truly be merciful, I have to acknowledge and admit that there is something very wrong here, something bad. Because if there's nothing wrong, they do not need mercy. And pretending like there's nothing wrong, I will never be able to show them true mercy. That when I acknowledge, yes, they fell in a hole and it's bad and they helped dig that hole, that's just a fact. But I can still help them try to get out of it. That's mercy. I'm not going to pretend like, oh, there's no hole there. That's false mercy. Failing to acknowledge that there's something broken that needs to be healed. That's why Christ says only those who are truly merciful will be shown mercy, because only they truly desire to know what it is and are willing to accept it when it comes along. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. The human heart is figured as like where the soul and all these things kind of reside, so to speak. It's where the desires of the person reside. It's where the motivation comes from. As a matter of fact, what does Jesus say in the gospel? He says all the evil things people do, he says, they first come from the heart. It says the heart that makes these decisions that the person then acts on. And our hearts become cluttered with many things, people, places, and things in this world. And sometimes vices, sometimes things that are bad that we like to hold on to. Certain flaws that I've just gotten used to and I've accepted, so to speak, as part of me. That means there's space in my heart now that is not occupied by God. Therefore, my heart is not entirely clean. What does Jesus tell us again? Where your treasure is, there also will your heart be. If my treasures and things of this world or people in this world, that's where my heart will be found. If it's in God, that's when it becomes purified. That's why Jesus says only the pure of heart can see God, because they've emptied their hearts of everything else and they've allowed him to move in first, and everything else that is important follows after him. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Another misunderstood concept. People seem to think peace in general means the absence of all conflict. No, it will never be that way on this world. Let's be realistic about it. We're human beings. We live in a broken world, a fallen world, and we are broken people. There's going to be conflict at times. It's going to happen. There's no way to avoid it forever because of the brokenness that exists in our world. And this pie in the sky idea that we can eliminate all conflict is a nice thought, but it won't happen. Archbishop Fulton Sheen used to say, there's not a war in the world that did not begin first in the human heart. So Christ is not talking about peace just in the earthly sense, and this is, again, where a lot of people get hung up. They think being in the peace of Christ means not having any problems in the world. All the wars, all the bad things have stopped, and everybody's hopping around like bunnies in the sunshine, and it's great and wonderful. Good idea. When's the last time that happened? Before Adam and Eve got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And it has not happened since. What does Christ say after his resurrection? He returns to his apostles and he says, my peace I give you, not as the world gives it, do I give it to you. So he's differentiating between what the world considers peace and what he offers as peace, because he knows his followers are going to suffer. He knows we're going to be in a battle. Sometimes it's with our own vices even. He knows there's going to be chaos and conflicts that we have to come up against. So his peace is something much deeper. It's inside the person. For instance, St. Blaise, Tuesday. He was so filled with God's peace, he was able to be tortured and martyred for that faith. He didn't run away. That's what God's peace does. It puts in here. And so peacemakers are those who lead others to Christ, who is the source of true peace. That's why God says they are children of God, because they've allowed themselves to be enveloped by Christ and his peace and are trying to bring others into his family. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not those who are persecuted because of their own stupidity, but for the sake of righteousness. Again, righteousness. Those who suffer because they desire God's will above all things and in all things, that they will not compromise or sell the truth to the highest bidder. That they are willing to take a stand on the big moral issues of our day, which if you do, you already know they're going to look for a cross to nail you to. It's going to happen. They did it to him. So Jesus says, those who are persecuted for the sake of the righteousness of the truth of God, which he reveals to us through his Son, through the scriptures, through his church, he says, they will inherit the kingdom of heaven because they were willing to make the sacrifices necessary. They were willing to go to battle for it. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, your reward will be great in heaven. Falsely. This again means it's not they're just being mean to you because you did something dumb. He says it's false. They're doing it because they know how much we love God and desire his will to be done. Not because of my flaws, and that's usually what happens is I'm getting insulted because of my stupidity and my flaws. But Jesus says when they do it because of me, because of your love of me and your willingness to sacrifice everything for me, he says, then rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. And so this is a tall order to follow these things. It's not easy sometimes. Lord knows. And there are those times when we fall down or we run away. It happens. 12 apostles. 1 came back after they ran from Gethsemane. John also ran from Gethsemane, keep that in mind, but he's the only one who came back all the way. Peter came back part of the way. He was on the outside. John goes into the trial. John is there at the crucifixion. John returns. He's the one whom Jesus loved because his love of Christ was so deep and so pure that he was able to overcome his lapse, his bad decision to run, and he came back. And he wasn't embarrassed to stand next to the mother of the convicted. So out of 12, 1 came back. The 11 others, 1 kept on running until he was so far away from God's grace that he no longer saw the point of living even. Judas. The other 10, they ended up coming back because after they had run, they realized from whom they had run. They realized that they separated themselves from the one who brought peace, from the one who gave them hope, from the source of their faith and their strength. They realized that after a little while, and they came back. And so resolved were they not to do this again, that all 10 of those who came back were tortured and martyred within 30 years of that day for refusing to run again. And so while we do run and we do make mistakes, it happens. It happens to the best of them. We can always come back. But I shouldn't just come back alone. I should try to bring others with me. And so let us keep that in mind. The good Lord has called us and desires us to be his witnesses in the world, to return to him with all our hearts and souls, and to be able to rejoice and be glad in the knowledge that our reward will be great in heaven. And so now please stand.